Brooke had texted the group chat before she even walked through the door. "Give me 15 minutes. This will be a great story." She sat at the best table in the restaurant, her Chanel bag on the chair beside her, like a second guest, already composing the punchline in her head. A 38-year-old carpenter. A 6-year-old from a broken marriage. Her mother called it an opportunity. Her friends called it a crisis. Brooke just called it a Thursday. But 2 hours later, she still hadn't texted anyone back, and she didn't know why. Brooke Calloway had grown up in a house with 6 bathrooms and a sense of exactly where she stood in the world. Her father, Dale Calloway, had built his commercial real estate portfolio from 2 strip malls in the 1990s into something that stretched across 6 states in the Midwest. Brooke had attended Worthington Christian School through 12th grade, spent a year in London studying abroad, and come back to Columbus with an accent she didn't keep and a clarity she did. She wasn't spoiled, she was clear-eyed. There was a difference, and she would be the first to explain it to you. She worked as a brand manager at a marketing agency downtown, not because she needed the salary, but because she needed to know she could build something herself. She was good at her job, precise, creative, unafraid to push back on a client who didn't know what they wanted. Her colleagues respected her. Her boss had told her twice in 1 year that she was being groomed for a director role. She dressed well, lived well, and had a very specific idea of what her life was supposed to look like going forward. When her friends asked what she was looking for, in a man, she didn't say rich. She said, someone who has his life together. And she meant it in every sense of the phrase. Education, ambition, a certain kind of presence that told you this person belonged in the same rooms you did. It was a reasonable standard. That was what she told herself every time someone called it picky. The note from her mother had been sitting on the dining room table when Brooke came home one Thursday evening, a small cream card, her mother's handwriting looping across it in the particular way that meant Carol Calloway had given this a great deal of thought. A restaurant name, a date, a time, and at the bottom, just this once, sweetheart. Brooke had read it twice before she set it down and walked to the kitchen to pour herself a glass of water. A carpenter. Her mother had found her a carpenter through someone in her charity league, a woman whose son had hired him to redo a kitchen or build a bookcase or something. And apparently, the whole experience had been so wonderful that Carol Calloway had decided this was information relevant to her youngest daughter's love life. Brooke brought the card back to the dining room table, where her mother was already watching her with the careful expression of a woman who had rehearsed this moment. A carpenter. Mom, Brooke said. With a 6-year-old, we didn't say it cruelly. She said it the way you'd say, a left turn here. Are you sure? As if the directions were simply wrong, and a correction would save everyone time. Her mother didn't argue. Carol Calloway rarely argued. She redirected. She looked down the length of the dining room table to where Dale Calloway sat, at the head, eating slowly, the color in his face, still not quite what it had been before the surgery 3 weeks earlier. He looked up when the room went quiet. He looked at Brooke. He said, "Just go once, for me." His voice was the same as always, steady, unhurried, but there was something underneath it that Brooke didn't want to examine too closely. She looked at the pallor of his skin. She looked at the card in her hand. She didn't say anything else. She arrived at the restaurant 8 minutes early and chose the table nearest the exit. Not because she was planning to leave, she told herself, but because she liked to be able to see the whole room. She ordered sparkling water, set her bag on the chair beside her, and pulled out her phone to send the message she'd been composing in her head since she'd left the house. About to meet the carpenter dad, she typed into the group chat, "Wish me luck. Or don't, this will be a great story either way." The response from her friend came back in under 30 seconds. "Please take notes." Brooke smiled and put her phone face down on the table. She was already thinking about how she would describe this later, the awkward silences, the mismatched world views, the polite struggle to find common ground, before one of them invented a reason to leave. She was good at stories. This one would be easy. Ray Donahue walked in at exactly 7 o'clock, which she noted because she hadn't expected punctuality. He was wearing a navy button-down shirt that had been pressed, and his hands, even from across the room, had the particular look of hands that had been washed carefully before going out, but still carried the memory of work in the grain of the skin. He wasn't what she'd pictured. She had pictured someone slightly sheepish, slightly apologetic, someone who would come in already aware that this was a mismatch and would spend the evening trying to compensate for it. Ray Donahue did not look like he was compensating for anything. He looked around the room until he found her table, and he walked toward it with the particular ease of a man who was simply going where he was going. He was not alone. Beside him, holding his hand with the grip of a child who had learned that public places required anchoring, was a small girl in a yellow dress. The girl had dark eyes and her father's unhurried quality. She looked around the restaurant, not with the fidgeting of boredom, but with the genuine interest of someone cataloging information. When they reached the table, Ray pulled out the chair across from Brooke and settled the girl into it before sitting down himself. "I'm sorry," he said, and his voice was low and even. "My sitter canceled an hour ago. I can reschedule if this isn't okay." He said it straightforwardly, without the performance of excessive apology. He was giving her information and offering a solution the way you would with anyone reasonable. Brooke opened her mouth. The word "actually" was right there already. Formed the polite exit already taking shape, but before she could say it, the girl reached into the small canvas bag on her lap and placed something on the table between them. It was a bear, small, carved from a single piece of pale wood, worn smooth in the places where small hands had held it longest. The girl looked at Brooke with the absolute seriousness that belongs only to 6-year-olds. "You can hold him if you want," she said. "He makes people feel better." The restaurant went on around them, the clink of glasses, the murmur of other conversations. But at their small table near the exit, Brooke Calloway looked at a wooden bear the size of her palm and found that the word "actually" had disappeared entirely. She looked up at Ray. He wasn't watching her with any kind of expectation. He had picked up the menu. He said without looking over, "Her name is Penny. She's been carrying that bear since she was 3. He said it the way you'd offer any relevant piece of context, matter-of-factly, without asking anything in return. Brooke looked back at the bear. It was not a rough thing, not a child's approximation of an animal. Every line of it was deliberate. The curve of the ears, the slight tilt of the head, the way the wood had been sanded until it gave back the light. Someone had spent a very long time making this small thing. Brooke did not pick it up, but she didn't move it aside either. She set the menu in front of her and looked at it without reading a single word. She did not leave after 15 minutes. 45 minutes passed, and then an hour, and then a little more than 2 hours, and the sparkling water became dinner, and dinner became coffee. She didn't usually order this late. She did not pick up her phone from where it sat face down on the table. She did not compose the story she had been planning to tell. Outside the restaurant, her group chat was almost certainly full of messages she wasn't reading. Penny had fallen asleep in her chair by 8:30, head tipped against her father's arm, the wooden bear tucked under her cheek. Ray had moved his arm to accommodate her, without interrupting what he was saying, the way people do things they have done so many times, they no longer notice doing them. Brooke watched this. She didn't say anything about it. She just watched, and then looked away, and then when she thought he wasn't paying attention, watched again. When they finally stood to leave, Ray lifted Penny without waking her, settling the girl against his shoulder with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times in parking lots and doorways and the quiet ends of evenings. He said goodnight to Brooke simply without making it into anything more than it was. He did not ask about a second meeting. He did not perform any kind of hope. He said goodnight the way you'd say goodnight to someone you'd had a genuinely good conversation with, warmly and without need. Brooke watched him carry his daughter through the restaurant door and into the night. Then she stood alone at the best table, her Chanel bag in her hand, 15 minutes of material she had never collected, and absolutely no idea what she was going to say when she finally turned her phone back over. She finally turned her phone over in the car sitting in the restaurant parking lot, with the engine running and the heat on low. The group chat had 17 new messages. Haley had sent 3 question marks in a row, then a voice memo Brooke didn't play. Then, "Hello, what happened?" "Did you survive?" Brooke looked at the screen for a long moment. Then she typed 2 words, "It was fine," and put the phone in her bag. She sat with the engine running for another minute before she pulled out of the lot, and the whole drive home she couldn't have told you what song was on the radio because she wasn't listening to it. Haley called at 7:45 the next morning, which was not unusual. What was unusual was the tone, not the teasing she'd expected, but something sharper, almost offended, as if Brooke had broken a social contract. "Fine," Haley said, and she said it the way you'd repeat a word in a foreign language you weren't sure you'd heard correctly. That's it. Brooke Calloway goes on a blind date with a single dad carpenter and comes back with "fine." Brooke was making coffee, and she looked at the cabinet above the machine for a second before she answered. "It wasn't terrible," she said. "He was, I don't know. He was normal." The word came out sounding less like a dismissal than she'd intended, and she knew Haley heard it that way too, because the line went quiet for exactly 1 beat before Haley said, "Normal. Okay. Sure." The next several days arrived with the particular texture of pressure coming from 2 directions at once. Haley and the rest of the group chat had recovered from their initial confusion and settled into something more comfortable, gentle mockery, the kind that assumed Brooke was still in on the joke. Someone sent a listing for a house in Westerville with a small yard and the caption, "Your future home." Someone else found a tutorial on how to strip and refinish hardwood floors and sent it with 3 laughing emojis. Brooke read each message and typed nothing back. Meanwhile, her mother called every day, not to push exactly, but to ask small questions that amounted to the same thing. Had she heard from him? Had she thought about it? Did she want Carol to reach out to the woman who had made the introduction? Brooke said she was busy. She said she'd think about it. She said the things you say when you're not ready to say the real thing. She did text Ray once, 3 days after the dinner, a short message thanking him for the evening. He responded within the hour. "It was a good night. Penny talked about you on the way home." Brooke read that twice, then set the phone down and went back to work. Over the following days, when he texted, she answered briefly with the careful economy of someone keeping a door open exactly 1 inch. She told herself this was reasonable. She was being cautious. She was not, she decided, being a coward. Ray did not press. He did not perform impatience. When her responses slowed to almost nothing, he sent a single message that said, "No pressure. I know this is a lot." She stared at that message longer than any of the others. It was the absence of need in it that unsettled her. He wasn't asking her to hurry, wasn't asking her to want this, wasn't asking for anything at all. She didn't know what to do with a person who didn't need her to decide. It was around this time that she learned through her mother that the kitchen Ray had renovated for Carol's friend, the one that had started all of this, was a project that had been featured in an architectural magazine out of Cincinnati. Not a local flyer, a magazine. Her mother mentioned it in passing the way she mentioned most things she wanted Brooke to think about, and Brooke filed it away without comment. But that evening, she found the magazine's website on her laptop and found the project a full kitchen renovation in a Victorian house in German Village. Every cabinet custom-built the island, a single slab of white oak that Ray had sourced and milled himself. The photographs were the kind that made you stop scrolling. The work was extraordinary. She closed the laptop and sat in her apartment in the quiet and thought about how he had never once mentioned it. 3 weeks after the dinner, Brooke's car was the nearest option when Ray's truck broke down on Henderson Road on a Saturday afternoon. She had been on her way back from a client meeting, and she took the call without thinking, pulled over without thinking, and drove them both home without thinking much about any of it, until Penny fell asleep in the back seat, and Ray turned the radio down without being asked, and the car got very quiet. She dropped them at the small house in Westerville, a house that was modest on the outside and meticulously kept with a front porch that had a new railing Ray had clearly made himself. And that was that. Except that when she got home, she found a small blue scarf on the back seat, folded the way children fold things, which is to say approximately. It was Penny's. She should have texted Ray. She meant to text Ray. Instead, 9 days later, she found herself driving to Westerville at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night with the scarf on the passenger seat. She told herself she was passing nearby anyway, which was not entirely true, and that it made more sense to drop it off than to coordinate a pickup, which was not entirely logical. And by the time she arrived at the address, she had stopped explaining herself and was simply driving. The house was dark, except for one window at the side the workshop Ray had built in what used to be the garage, its light spilling yellow across the driveway. She parked and sat in the car. Then she got out, walked to the workshop window, and looked in. Ray was at his workbench with his back to the window. He was working on something small, a box roughly the size of a shoebox, made of a dark wood she didn't recognize. He held a small hand tool she couldn't name, and he was moving it across the surface of the box in short, careful strokes, the kind of motion that required absolute stillness in the rest of the body. She could see even through the glass that he was carving something along the side of the box, a pattern of small shapes, repeating precise. She watched his hands. They moved with the same quality she'd noticed at the restaurant. No performance, no impatience, no awareness of being observed. He was simply in the work fully, and without remainder, the way very few people she knew were ever fully anywhere. She stood in the cold for a long time. She did not knock. She thought about the men she had dated over the years, the ones with the business school pedigrees, and the strong opinions about wine, and the way they talked about their own ambitions, with their chins slightly lifted, as if the future were a room they were already standing in. She had found them attractive. She had respected certain things about them. But watching them had never felt like this. This particular quality of stillness, of being in the presence of someone who had nothing to prove, because the work itself was the point. She stood outside in the November cold with a 6-year-old scarf in her hand and asked herself for the first time with any honesty what exactly it was she had spent the last decade optimizing for. She did not have a clean answer. She walked back to her car and drove home, and she left the scarf on her passenger seat because she would need a reason to come back. Haley figured it out at lunch, which Brooke should have anticipated, because Haley had always been able to read her in the specific way that only people who've known you since college can, not from what you say, but from the shape of what you don't. They were at the Italian place on High Street that they went to every few weeks, and Haley was talking about someone she'd been seeing, and then she stopped mid-sentence and looked at Brooke with the focused attention of a person who has just noticed something. "You haven't made a single joke about him," Haley said. "Not one. Every time someone brings him up in the chat, you just go quiet." Brooke picked up her water glass. "I've been busy," she said. Haley kept watching her. "Brooke," she said, "come on, he has a kid. He drives a truck that's older than your handbag. Do you know what people will say?" Brooke set the glass down. She looked at the table. The honest answer was that she had started to care less about what people would say, which was itself the most disorienting thing that had happened to her in recent memory. More disorienting than the dinner, more disorienting than the workshop window, because not caring what people said was not something she had ever practiced, and she wasn't sure she was doing it right. She didn't say any of this to Haley. She said nothing, which turned out to be worse, because Haley's expression shifted from teasing to something more careful, and she said quietly, "Oh my God, you actually like him?" Brooke looked up. "It's not that simple," she said. Haley looked at her for another moment. "It kind of is, though," she said. And then neither of them said anything for a while, and the waiter came and went, and the afternoon light moved across the restaurant floor, and Brooke sat with the uncomfortable knowledge that her best friend had just said something true. She drove home from that lunch replaying the conversation in the way she usually replayed conversations she wanted to argue with. She found that she couldn't locate the argument. Haley wasn't wrong about the facts. The truck, the kid, the gap between their lives that anyone looking from the outside would see immediately. What Haley was wrong about, or maybe not wrong, but incomplete, was what the facts added up to. Brooke had spent a lot of her life believing that the facts of a situation were sufficient to describe it. She was beginning to think that might have been the most expensive assumption she'd ever made. She did not call Haley back that evening. She texted Ray instead, a real text this time, not 2 words, but a full sentence, asking how the workshop project was going. He responded with a photograph. It was the box from the window further along now, the pattern of carved shapes along the side more visible. They were musical notes, small and even, and running the length of the box like a melody you could almost hear. Brooke looked at the photograph for a long time before she wrote back, "It's beautiful. What's it for?" Ray's response came after a few minutes. "Penny's birthday. 3 weeks." It was the following Saturday that Brooke found herself sitting at Ray's kitchen table for the first time, having been invited carefully without pressure to see the workshop in daylight. She had said yes before she finished thinking about whether to say yes, which was itself notable. The house was small and warm, and completely itself. No performance in the furniture or the arrangement of things, just a place where someone actually lived. Penny moved through it with the confidence of a child who had never been told to be careful picking things up and setting them down, and asking Brooke questions with the directness that small children share with very old people. She asked what Brooke did for work. She asked if Brooke had a dog. She asked with the gravity of someone raising an important procedural point whether Brooke liked strawberry cake, because that was what she was having for her birthday. Brooke said she did. Penny considered this and nodded. "Good," she said, "because Dad's making it from scratch, and it's going to be really good, and you should come." Brooke looked at Ray over the top of Penny's head. He was standing at the counter, not quite smiling, watching his daughter negotiate. "You don't have to," he said. Brooke looked back at Penny. "I'll be there," she said. Penny accepted this as settled and moved on to the next item of business, and Brooke sat with the words she'd just said there, and all the territory it quietly implied. She stayed 2 hours. On the way home, she thought about the birthday still weeks away, and the box of musical notes that wasn't finished yet, and the way Ray had said, "You don't have to," without any of the weight that people usually put into those words when they want you to hear the opposite. He had simply meant it. She was not used to people simply meaning things. She didn't know whether that was a problem with him or a problem with everyone she'd been surrounding herself with, and she wasn't ready to answer that question. So she drove home through the dark and didn't try. The weeks that followed moved the way time moves when you're aware of it slowly and then suddenly. There were more texts with Ray, longer ones, and one phone call that lasted almost 2 hours and wandered from her work to his work, to a book Penny had made him read 4 times in a row and back again. There was an afternoon when Brooke brought coffee to the workshop and sat on a stool and watched him work while they talked about nothing consequential, and she noticed that it was the most relaxed she'd been in a space that wasn't her own apartment in longer than she could remember. She did not examine this too carefully. She was learning slowly to let some things be what they were without immediately categorizing them. The night before Penny's birthday, Brooke's phone lit up at 2:12 in the morning, Ray's name on the screen. She was awake before she registered the sound, some instinct pulling her up from sleep. She answered. Ray's voice was even the voice of someone holding themselves very deliberately in one piece. He said Penny had spiked a fever 2 hours ago and then seized, and he was already in the car, heading to Nationwide Children's Hospital, and he was okay. Penny was okay. The paramedic had said it looked like a febrile seizure, and those were common in young children, but they were going to the hospital and he stopped. Then he said, "I'm calling because you told Penny you'd come to her birthday, and I didn't know who else would pick up." Brooke stood up in the dark of her bedroom. She understood what he was saying and what he wasn't saying. He wasn't asking her to come. He was telling her why he'd called, leaving the rest entirely to her. She found her keys on the hook by the door. She was in the car before she had made any conscious decision to be there, which told her something she would spend a long time thinking about afterward, that the decision had already been made somewhere she hadn't been paying attention, in the slow accumulation of coffee in a workshop, and 2-hour phone calls, and a little girl asking with absolute seriousness whether she liked strawberry cake. Nationwide Children's Hospital at 3 in the morning had a particular kind of light, not the warm fluorescent of daytime, but something flatter and more honest, the kind of light that doesn't allow for performance. Brooke found the emergency entrance and walked through the automatic doors into a waiting area that smelled of antiseptic and recycled air. She spotted Ray before he saw her. He was standing at the admissions desk, still in the clothes he'd clearly thrown on in a hurry, a gray Henley jeans boots unlaced at the top, and he was talking to the woman behind the counter in the measured voice of someone who has decided that staying calm is the only useful thing left to do. His wallet was open on the counter. She could see from where she stood that the conversation was not going the way he needed it to go. She didn't say his name. She walked to the counter, set her card down next to his wallet, and told the woman behind the desk that she was covering the deposit. The woman looked at the card, looked at Brooke, looked at Ray. Ray had gone still. The transaction took less than 2 minutes. When it was done, and the woman had directed them to the waiting area outside the pediatric emergency bay, Ray turned to look at Brooke, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything at all. There was nothing to perform in that hallway, no version of the moment that called for the kind of words people usually reach for. She had come. He had needed someone to come. The rest of it could wait. They sat down on a row of blue plastic chairs against the wall, the particular shade of blue that exists only in institutions cheerful in theory and exhausting in practice. Ray put his elbows on his knees and pressed his hands against his face. Brooke sat beside him with her coat still on her bag in her lap, looking at the set of double doors that separated them from wherever Penny was. The hallway had the sound of a place running at reduced capacity, distant monitors, the occasional footstep, a voice from somewhere giving instructions in a tone too low to make out. It was the loudest quiet Brooke had ever sat inside. She did not try to fill it. She had spent a great deal of her life filling quiet with the right thing to say, the competent response, the controlled and useful contribution. She sat in that hallway at 3 in the morning and said nothing, and it was not a failure. It was the most present she had been in a very long time. Ray lifted his head after a while and looked at the doors. His face had the open, undefended quality of someone who has run out of the energy required for composure. Not broken. She didn't think Ray broke in the way most people meant when they used that word, but stripped back, reduced to what was actually there underneath. He was afraid. He was trying not to transfer that fear into the room because there was a 6-year-old behind those doors who depended on him to be the steadiest thing in her world, and he was doing the work of that even now, even here, even when Penny couldn't see him. Brooke watched him do this and understood something she hadn't had language for before, that what she'd been calling steadiness in him all these weeks was not the absence of fear. It was the decision, made over and over, to act anyway. A doctor came out at 4:37, young, tired, with the careful reassurance of someone delivering news they knew was good, but understood had to land gently. Febrile seizure, she said. Frightening to witness, but not dangerous in themselves. Penny's fever had come down significantly. They would monitor her for another few hours, and then she could go home. The doctor said a few more things about follow-up and hydration and what to watch for, and Ray listened to all of it with the focused attention of a man committing every word to memory. When the doctor left, he sat back down. He put his head back against the wall and closed his eyes for a moment, and Brooke watched the tension leave his shoulders, the way water leaves a glass all at once completely. They let Ray in to sit with Penny at 5 o'clock, and Brooke stayed in the hallway. She got 2 cups of coffee from a machine down the corridor, the kind of coffee that exists purely as a vehicle for warmth and caffeine, with no ambitions beyond that. And she held both of them and waited. The hospital was beginning its slow shift toward morning. The light didn't change, but the sounds did. More footsteps, more voices, the particular acceleration of a building, remembering what it was for. Brooke sat with her coffee and thought about nothing with great concentration, which is a thing you can only do when you've stopped trying to manage the outcome of a situation and have simply arrived inside it. Ray came back out at 6:23. He sat down beside her, and she handed him the second cup of coffee without comment. He took it. They sat like that for a minute, 2 people with hospital coffee in a hallway that was beginning to fill with early morning light from a window at the far end. Ray looked at the window. Then he said, not turning toward her, "You didn't have to come." Brooke looked at the window too. "I know," she said. Ray turned the cup in his hands. He didn't say anything for a moment, and she didn't rush him. "I know you know," he said finally. I'm not saying it like a formality. I mean, you genuinely didn't have to, and you came anyway. And I want you to know that I know the difference." Brooke considered this. It was the most precise thing anyone had said to her in recent memory. She had been thanked many times in her life competently and warmly by people who meant it. This was not that. This was something more careful in acknowledgement, not just of the action, but of what it had cost. She was trying to find words that were equal to the moment when Ray said something else. He was still looking at the window, still turning the cup in his hands, and his voice had dropped to the register people use when they're saying something. They mean to say exactly once, and exactly right. "I see you, Brooke," he said. "Not the version you show everyone, the one who stood outside my shop window in the cold and didn't knock." Brooke went very still. She had not told him about that night. She turned to look at him. He was still looking at the window, but the corner of his mouth had shifted by some fraction of a degree that meant he knew she was looking. "The light reflects off the glass," he said simply. "I could see you in it." Brooke looked back at the window at the end of the hall. She thought about standing in the November dark in her good coat, with a 6-year-old scarf in her hand, watching a man carve musical notes into a birthday present at 11 o'clock at night. And she thought about all the ways she had tried to explain to herself why she'd driven out there, none of which had been the true reason, the reason being simply that she had wanted to see him, and she had not been ready to say that yet, not even to herself. "I'm not asking for anything," Ray said. He said it with the same directness he brought to everything, not a deflection, but a statement of fact. "I just wanted you to know that I see you. That's all." He drank his coffee. The window at the end of the hall had gone from gray to pale gold, the particular color of early morning in November, when the sky is clear and the city is just beginning. Brooke held her cup in both hands and sat with what he had said. She did not deflect it. She did not reframe it, or qualify it, or set it aside for later examination. She let it be what it was, which was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in longer than she could measure. And she sat inside it, the way she had sat inside the quiet of the hallway, without trying to manage it, without looking for the exit. Penny was discharged at 8:45 in the morning, still drowsy, her hair tangled from the hospital pillow, and her small face carrying the particular blankness of a child who has been through something she doesn't entirely understand. Ray carried her out through the lobby with the wooden bear tucked in beside her. One of the nurses had found it in the bag Ray had thrown together in the dark and given it to Penny when she woke up, and Penny had not let go of it since. Brooke held the door. Penny, half asleep against her father's shoulder, opened her eyes. When they stepped into the morning air, looked at Brooke, and said, with the solemn matter-of-factness of the very young and the very tired, "You came." Brooke looked at this small person in the yellow light of a November morning, this child who had offered her a wooden bear within 5 minutes of meeting her because she thought it might help, who had asked about strawberry cake, with the seriousness of someone establishing the terms of a treaty, who had simply assumed that a promise made would be a promise kept. "I came," Brooke said. Penny's eyes drifted closed again. She tightened her grip on the bear. Brooke drove home alone back into Columbus as the city came fully awake around her. She did not turn the radio on. She did not call anyone. She pulled into the parking garage beneath her building and sat with her hands in her lap, not thinking exactly, but settling the way you settle after a long night, when stillness suddenly feels unfamiliar and you need a moment before you can be in one place again. She looked at her hands. These were the hands that had set a card down on a hospital counter at 3 in the morning, without thinking about it, without calculating the implications, without asking herself first whether it was the right move. She had not in that moment been performing competence or generosity or any of the other things she was good at performing. She had simply done the thing that needed to be done because she had been there, and she was the person who was there. And it turned out that was enough of a reason. She went upstairs. She made coffee, real coffee from the good machine, not the gray hospital approximation she'd been drinking for the last several hours. She stood at the window of her apartment while it brewed and looked out at Columbus in the full light of morning, the buildings, the trees along the street below, still holding the last of their November leaves. The sky overhead, a clean, uninterrupted blue, with no weather in it at all. She thought about the wooden bear. She thought about the hum of a workshop at 11 at night, and a magazine she'd looked up on her laptop and closed without mentioning, and a card on a dining room table in her mother's handwriting. She thought about a man who had called her at 2:12 in the morning, not because she was the obvious choice, but because she was the one who had made a promise to his daughter, and he had trusted her to remember it. She thought about all the versions of her life she had been carefully constructing, the right address, the right career, the right kind of person standing beside her in the image of it, and she thought about how none of those constructions had ever made her feel the way she'd felt, sitting on a blue plastic chair in a hospital hallway, saying nothing, being exactly where she was. The coffee finished. She poured a cup. She carried it back to the window and stood in the morning light. And she thought about the question Ray had not asked her, the one that had been present in every conversation, every text, every photograph of a half-finished music box, the question he had consistently refused to pressure her into answering because he was a person who understood that some things had to arrive on their own time, or not at all. She had spent the past weeks circling it. She had told herself she was being thoughtful, cautious, appropriately measured. She understood now that she had been afraid not of Ray, not of Penny, not of the truck or the house in Westerville, or what Haley would say, but of the particular vulnerability of wanting something you couldn't make ironic, of wanting something that required you to be sincere about it, of choosing something not because it fit the architecture of your life, but because it felt in the truest and least manageable part of you like the right thing. She stood in her apartment in the morning light and let herself want it without apology. It felt strangely like putting something down that she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. She picked up her phone. Her mother answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the particular alertness of a woman who had been half awake since 2 in the morning, waiting for a call she didn't know to expect. "Brooke, where were you last night? I called this morning and—" Brooke looked out at the blue sky over Columbus, unbroken and clear from one edge of her window to the other. "Tell them yes, Mom," she said. The line went quiet. Then her mother said carefully, "Are you sure?" Brooke thought about a 6-year-old pressing a wooden bear across a restaurant table because she thought it might help. She thought about a man standing in a workshop at 11 o'clock at night, carving music into wood for a child who wouldn't see it for weeks. She thought about blue plastic chairs and pale gold morning light and the specific weight of a choice made not from calculation, but from the place in yourself that already knows. "Yeah," she said. "I'm sure." She hung up. She didn't explain. She didn't need to explain, not to her mother, not to Haley, not to the part of herself that had spent 27 years building a very detailed argument for a different kind of life. She set the phone face down on the windowsill and wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and stood in the morning light and smiled. Not because everything was settled, not because she knew exactly how any of it would go, but because for the first time in as long as she could remember, the choice she had made was entirely, uncomplicatedly her own, and that she was discovering was its own kind of arriving.